Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Autonomous Vehicles, Disruption or Disappointment. My name is Chris Robinson, Research Director here at Lux, and I'm joined today by Louis Roberts, Senior Research Associate. Throughout today's webinar, you can type in any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. And if your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll respond. So today's topic is on autonomous vehicles, and it's a topic that we get a lot of questions from clients on from pretty diverse backgrounds, ranging from utilities to CPG and even chemicals and materials companies. And I think everyone agrees that vehicles are going to be more automated in the future. We're getting some more agreement on what those timelines for autonomous vehicles are and kind of which technologies are going to be required to enable it. I think the one area where there remains a decent amount of disagreement is what happens when we have autonomous vehicles to the mobility industry and the automotive industry. One of the key talking points of autonomous vehicles is that it's going to usher in this era of decreased car ownership, where we consume mobility through mobility services, in this case, robo taxis or fleets of autonomous taxis, and that it will really disrupt the trillion-dollar automotive industry. And that's the topic for today's webinar. We're going to share our recent research looking at what happens when we have autonomous vehicles commercialized. So to kick things off today, we'll start with kind of a brief overview and background on robotaxis, kind of how we got to where we are today. And we're going to ask two important questions. One, is the robotaxi technically possible? And two, if it is possible, is it practical? And then ultimately, Louis and I will have a discussion as to whether we think this will be a disruptive or disappointing innovation. Now, to kick things off, I often talk about electrification being the most important technical trend in the automotive industry as they face increasing emissions reductions targets and fuel efficiency targets. But autonomous vehicles really hold, I think, tremendous disruptive potential, fundamentally changing how we are moving people and things. And we're starting to see some of the first use cases emerge. I think we've seen increases in e-commerce volumes and especially food delivery volumes over the last year. And we've applied autonomous vehicle technology to smaller form factors, doing things like delivering food and groceries. We've seen autonomy applied to the logistics space. Here we're showing Volvo's Vera, where it's actually moving containerized container vessels within a port. But when we talk about autonomous vehicles, generally the first thing we think about are robo taxis. Companies in this space have the biggest valuations. They're typically the most well-known and are the ones really taking a pretty square aim at the trillion-dollar automotive industry. And with this disruptive potential, we've seen a lot of capital flowing into the space. We've tracked roughly $40 billion worth of investments going into companies developing autonomous vehicle technology. And generally, this number is increasing. We did have a slight decrease last year, but so far through 2021, we're already on track to set another annual record for annual funding in the autonomous vehicle space. And it really is a very expensive, complex problem to solve. Even someone like Waymo, despite having the deep pockets of Alphabet at its disposal, last year saw external funding for the first time, in total raising just over $3 billion in 2020. And elsewhere, we've seen other tech companies be heavily involved. Automakers are forming partnerships on this, and even institutional investors are getting involved in this space. So we have a pretty diverse array of people funding this $40 billion of investments. We've also taken a close look at partnerships forming in this space and have found that, similar to a diverse array of investors, having a diverse array of partners is, in some ways equally as important. If we look at leaders in this space, some of the larger robotaxi companies, Cruise, Waymo, and AutoX, they formed a lot of partnerships with automakers who, more or less can provide the vehicle technology. As Tesla has shown, it is not trivial to make a vehicle from scratch, and these partners are important for robotaxi companies. Additionally, we can look at some of the other, maybe more novel form factors. EasyMile, Navia, and May Mobility are all focused on slow speed, higher passenger occupancy vehicles, and as such have formed robust partnerships with tier one suppliers. And elsewhere, you can look at some of the blue names here, which are the robotaxi companies, and all of them have several partnerships to help them commercialize their solutions. So we have a lot of disruptive potential, we have a lot of funding, and we're having a lot of partnerships formed. But I think we also have to recognize that timelines for autonomous vehicles have slipped. We can look at a few examples. One, Ford, typically a more conservative automaker, not one to make bold technological claims. They had claimed 4 years ago that we would be seeing no pedals, no steering wheel, and level 4 vehicles made by Ford this year. Obviously, that hasn't happened. They've released Blue Cruise, which is a hands-free level 2 highway system this year. You can also look at John Krafcik, the now former CEO of Waymo, and he noted, when he joined the group in 2015, that it really wasn't, a crazy idea to think that they would have a broadly available service by 2020. They believe that was a very realistic target. Obviously, they've also missed the mark there. And if we're going to talk about timelines for autonomous vehicles and missed deadlines, we'd be remiss in not mentioning Tesla, who just 2 years ago told us that we'd have essentially vehicles with no steering wheel, no pedals, but also we'd be able to send our vehicles out to be part of Robo Taxi fleets, making roughly $35,000 a year, which certainly has not happened yet. And I think all of this has created kind of two camps, two schools of thinking around autonomous vehicles. There's kind of this disruption crowd that really fundamentally believes autonomy is going to change everything about the way we're moving people and things. That if you're moving something, it will be automated, and therefore the concepts of car ownership and even commercial drivers will likely disappear sometime in the next decade or two. Then there's kind of this other school of thought that looks at these slipping timelines, looks at the enormous technical challenge that autonomous vehicles are, and believe it will never quite advance enough to be truly disruptive, and that we will have more automation in our vehicles, but we're still going to own them and commercial drivers will still exist. And that's really the focus of the webinar today. When we say disruption versus disappointment, what we're really talking about is, can robo taxis actually be the service that displaces conventional car ownership? Waymo was not once valued at $175 billion because it could replace Uber, because it could replace taxis. It was because it could fundamentally replace car ownership as we know it, $1 trillion industry. And so as I mentioned, we want to investigate two questions here, starting with, is this possible? So I'll invite my colleague Louis Roberts, our technical expert in autonomous vehicles, to address this first question.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be here today. I think the first thing that we want to ask when we're looking at this disruption versus disappointment question is, is the technology there? Is it ready? Is it possible? And immediately off the bat, I think that we can say yes. Based on current trends, robo-taxis are technically possible. We've seen both Waymo and AutoX launch some of the first public driverless rides without a safety driver within the vehicle. And launching this to the public has been a big first step. Now, just because robo-taxis are technically possible doesn't mean that they won't be limited. The robo-taxi isn't going to be a product that you can just put on the road and magically generate revenue forever. There are limitations on the tech, on the operations, and even the potential markets that pose some limitations to this business model. And these limitations are going to be especially important in analyzing the real business case for robo-taxis. Now, the first thing that we want to look at is, kind of the base tech. This is the thing that a lot of folks think of when you're thinking about robo-taxis and autonomous vehicles as a whole. So we're talking about things that sit on top of the cost of a standard vehicle. So they require, things like sensors, compute, software. We've estimated the current cost of autonomy systems like level 4 robo-taxis. You could see this graph on the right as kind of our own estimations out into 2040. As an example, the CEO of Mobileye recently said that a robo-taxi system probably costs around $40,000 today, but he expects that cost to drop to $15,000 by 2025. And I think while costs may drop overall, the need for these base technologies like radar, LiDAR, camera, compute, etc. These base technologies to enable robotaxis, they aren't going to go away as a whole. Now, there's also some unique operational costs for robotaxis. While maintenance for any fleet is an important part of cost analysis, robotaxis also have some unique costs from things like teleoperations labor and HD mapping. Although robotaxis will be able to operate without a driver, teleoperation services have still generally proven to be needed for troubleshooting when a vehicle runs into trouble. So for example, on the left-hand side here, we can see in a report from the information that Waymo has, in 2020 still required a remote assist dispatcher, as they call it, to monitor driverless rides, to help vehicles out of a jam when it doesn't know how to proceed safely. And Waymo was also still sending out a chase van to follow each driverless vehicle. And companies like Waymo, Mobileye, Voyage before it was acquired by Cruise, and others have all spoken about this need. And so you really don't, while the big draw of a robotaxi is being able to eliminate labor from the, I guess, the cost stack, it turns out that you're still kind of requiring labor through this teleoperation service. And like teleoperations, HD mapping, on the other hand, is an important input that does incur costs over time. HD maps, for those unfamiliar, are centimeter level precision maps that inform automated vehicles of things like lane geometries, objects in and around the lanes, permanent speed limits, that kind of thing. And because these are so detailed, it does require a lot of upkeep, a lot of maintenance to get up-to-date information to the vehicles. So together, these operational costs are pretty unique to robotaxis, and they add costs on top of the necessary base tech that we talked about in the last slide for robotaxis. The third thing that we need to consider is what we call the operational design domain. You might hear it as ODD for short, that a vehicle is going to operate in. The design domain defines the factors where an autonomous vehicle or robotaxi is expected to be capable of driving autonomously. So this includes things like geography. What kind of cities can you operate in? What kind of road conditions can you work in? Do you have an upper limit on speed? What kind of weather conditions can you work in? Is snow or rain going to be a problem? So for example, a robotaxi might be capable of operating in specific areas of specific cities, or maybe only in clear weather. And while I think that operational design domains will expand over time, they do pose limitations on what kind of markets can be addressed by a robotaxi. So overall, I would say that while robotaxis are here, they are possible. There are still some limitations to the technology, and as a result, the business case. Many of these areas are continuing to be improved upon as robotaxi development continues, and costs will come down for some enabling tech like sensors, while operational design domains will expand over time, so you can operate in more areas. However, it's important to recognize that there are some significant limits to what is possible on the business side because of these factors. Despite the high-tech hype, these machines are really quite a bit more limited than the human driver, and they aren't like manufacturing automation, where you can really clearly replace labor. Now, in the following section, we'll explore exactly how the human rideshare driver matches up against the robotaxi from a financial standpoint. I'll hand it back off to my colleague Chris to discuss some of these points.
Thanks, Louis. So yes, now on to the question, is it practical? And I think to kick things off, it's worth understanding that this is, a transition from ride hailing to robo taxis is really a fundamentally different business model. I think the statistic I often hear is that, well, 80% of Uber's gross bookings go toward paying its drivers. So if you can automate Uber, you can recapture a lot of the revenue you're paying drivers with, kind of the argument that Louis just made. But that's not exactly the case. And to highlight, how big of a shift in business models this is, we'll revisit a framework that we introduced about 2 years ago in a webinar like this one, where we were trying to kind of make sense of the hundreds of shared mobility startups that were becoming popular. And we did so through asking 2 questions, the important one being on the vertical axis here. Who owns the asset that is being shared? Now, in ride-hailing business, it's kind of like your classic internet business. You have an online marketplace, you're connecting buyers and sellers, or in this case, drivers and people who need rides, and taking a cut of each transaction. It's typically a very capital light business. What you are responsible for is really maintaining the platform, that online marketplace. But if we look at robo taxis, that's really more of the transit operator business model, where you're owning the assets being used to provide transit services. It's much more capital intensive. Companies in this space, think of public transit agencies, airlines, typically have slimmer margins. And so there are major financial implications of moving from a ride hailing to a robo taxi model. And it's important to really understand this change as a core kind of argument of the robo taxis will displace car ownership is the fact that it's just going to be cheaper. So we've been working on a model to try and analyze the impacts financially of this change. And so what we've done is, provided results from a scenario we run with a few thousand robo taxis in a city in the United States with a project lifetime of roughly 10 years. And we've used kind of taxi data, ride-hailing data on speed, number of pickups, et cetera, to understand kind of how much business these robo taxis could capture. And ultimately, we're going to share results as a function of cost per mile. So let's look first at the actual vehicle costs. After all, we need robo taxis in our fleet. We've assumed a vehicle cost of $35,000 vehicles. It's a bit high, but we also assume these vehicles will be electric, given that we don't believe cities will allow kind of fleets of combustion vehicles to operate within cities. And an added additional cost of $20,000 for the autonomous vehicle system. And just these costs alone, you would need to charge roughly 15 cents per mile to break even over the cost of 10 years. To break even on the cost of these vehicles. But we also need to keep these vehicles charged and on the road. So we have to consider infrastructure costs. Now here, we've included fast charging infrastructure to keep these vehicles on the road as quickly as possible, which we believe you can service with about 50 fast chargers, that fleet of 3,000 vehicles. And overall, this is a fairly small slice of the cost stack, just a few cents per mile that it adds. The slightly bigger portion actually comes from the energy you need for the vehicles. Now, electric vehicles are already pretty efficient. If we think about the urban setting where we expect robo taxis to typically operate, it's even more efficient because of regenerative braking. So overall, this is a little bit less than you might expect in the cost stack. And the combination of vehicles, infrastructure, and energy for those vehicles is roughly 20 cents per mile. Now we need to think about maintenance and operations, and this is where we add a pretty significant chunk to our robotaxi costs per mile. Louis mentioned the need for teleoperators. Here we've made a fairly conservative estimate that one teleoperator can oversee roughly 50 vehicles at each point in time. We've also assumed insurance costs, which I know there is some belief that eventually you'll be able to self-insure because these vehicles won't get in accidents. But the reality is if you want to deploy an autonomous vehicle in a city, that city is probably going to require you to have some form of insurance in that vehicle. So we've assumed basically in the very low end of what taxi insurance costs today. And then finally, maintenance. A small slice of this maintenance comes from general upkeep, just a few cents per mile, things like mechanical replacements. But a big chunk of maintenance comes from actually cleaning these vehicles. And similar to teleoperators, we've made some fairly conservative assumptions here. A cost per cleaning of $5, and you're going to clean the vehicle every other day. So these are all really the direct costs associated with a robo-taxi operation. The vehicles you need, the infrastructure you need, and kind of the oversight you need to keep that maintained on the road. But it's not exhaustive. There are some other costs which are more difficult to quantify. So operationally, you're going to have to need some sort of data connectivity, some sort of agreement with a telecom provider. There's a lot of data going in and out of these vehicles after all. There are also going to be one-time launch costs, which really vary from city to city. What kind of permits or medallions do you need? Or, what is the cost of mapping the environment for the first time are going to need to be considered. And then you've also got your kind of corporate overhead costs. So you're going to need to amortize R&D costs, marketing costs in a given market. You need to provide some customer support, and ultimately you need to provide some profit for your investors. So this 45 cents per mile is really, I think, kind of a baseline as to the minimum it could be. So ultimately, we need to answer, is this practical? So we'll compare it to some other types of mobility. Now, if we compare it just to ride hailing, it's a pretty attractive cost per mile. In ride hailing, typically the consumer is charged about $2 to $3 per mile in the United States, with that number going up in more densely populated urban environments. But as we mentioned, we're really interested in personal car ownership. And even the kind of the base minimum cost scenario we outlined for robotaxis is higher than our estimated total cost of ownership for a car, which here we've assumed once again, it's an electric vehicle, it's owned for 10 years by the user, and we use some maintenance data from Consumer Reports to come up with this number. And it's significantly more expensive if you're thinking about a scenario in which you already own a car and you're just paying, maybe an additional 5 cents per mile for fuel and maintenance on that vehicle. So there's still a discrepancy. Robotaxis still appear to be more expensive on a per mile basis than car ownership. So now we need to understand and answer the question, do we think it'll ultimately be disruptive or a disappointing innovation? So we'll ask Louis to join us once again to talk about whether this is going to be a disruption or a disappointment.
Yeah, so right here we have a little graphic, which is sort of a disruption speedometer. And in terms of leaning toward disappointment or disruption for robotaxis, I think that right now we are leaning toward disappointment.
Yeah, and a major part of that is due to the weak economics. Obviously, as I mentioned, a big part of the argument for robotaxis is the fact that these autonomous services will be, cheaper than car ownership. But, I think the other factor we have to consider here is, really the social and cultural aspects of car ownership. Car ownership is not just about finding the cheapest car to get you from point A to point B, obviously. We have luxury car brands, more expensive car brands. And, if you're familiar with the work of Joanna Moody at MIT, she's done some really interesting work kind of trying to quantify this car pride metric, so to speak, of, how much of a factor do we ascribe to the social status of car ownership? And she's found some really interesting work. One of the more interesting results being that once you account for things like gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, that this car pride metric was actually stronger in younger generations than in older generations. So I see, the poor economics, I see some cultural barriers to overcome. And I really struggle to see how robotaxis can meaningfully reduce rates of car ownership, within the next 20 years.
Yeah, I think those are some good points. But I don't know, when I think about, vehicle automation as a whole, I still think that a lot of this work is going to be useful, which is, I think why we haven't pushed the era all the way to disappointment. I think that things like level 2, level 3 features are going to be increasingly prominent in consumer vehicles. We've talked about Blue Cruise earlier, and then Super Cruise, and these are really important for automakers. This is a graphic from one of our existing reports, and I think here it's much easier to see the importance of level 2 advanced driver assistance systems, or ADAS, within the market. They really are going to make up the lion's share of importance, especially as we look, further out a few years, beyond that, there is going to be some interest in level 3 systems like highway traffic jam chauffeurs. But as a whole, level 4 robo taxi solutions are going to be such a small part of the market. Even if they become financially viable, that they really shouldn't be the main focus for automotive players right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Certainly we don't want to say that autonomous vehicle technology is not important or relevant. It's incredibly important. And even the robotaxi itself is probably considered a valuable development tool, even if it can't just be a standalone business. So kind of bringing back the graphic we showed earlier about how Cruise modified the Bolt. A lot of the sensors they're adding is very similar to what GM put on cars with Super Cruise. You have short and long range lidar or radar. You're not using a lidar sensor on the vehicle, but you are relying on lidar-based high definition maps to make that system function. External cameras, a chipset that's taking that information and synthesizing it to give more actionable commands to the vehicle. This is all technology that is really exists because of the focus on building autonomous vehicles, even if not robotaxis directly. So to summarize some points from today, one, I think it's inevitable that we are going to see robotaxis deployed. It's technically possible. They're not the kind of magic revenue generators, where you just kind of buy a vehicle, put it on the road, and it just kind of makes you money. But it still looks like it's going to come in at a price point that is able to disrupt other mobility services like ride-hailing and taxis. But ultimately, we think due to weak economics and some of the cultural barriers that it's not something that will maybe usher in this era of low car ownership rates and make a meaningful impact on that. And then finally, using robotaxis more as a development tool is a promising strategy. After all, we are forecasting more adoption of level 4 for personally owned vehicles and robotaxis. Robotaxis are a promising way to both, really engage with customers to get used to autonomous vehicle technology and generate revenue while you're optimizing and developing those systems. So at this point in time, I'll invite you once again for some questions. So if you want to use the questions box, we'll keep an eye on those. And I already see kind of a few coming in as well. Louis, maybe one for you. The focus of today was on robotaxis, and that's kind of how we viewed disruption or disappointment. But obviously, as we mentioned at the top, there are other applications for autonomy. So do you think there are more promising applications than robotaxis for autonomy?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different applications being explored. I think the one that's garnering a lot of interest, especially recently, is in the middle mile, specifically like highway trucking. We've seen Waymo and Aurora, put a lot more focus into, at least publicly, emphasizing some of the need for trucking, especially with a labor shortage at least in the U.S. And as we've seen some of those moves from some of those larger players, there's also a lot of smaller startups in the trucking space. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but one that's particularly interesting is a company called Locomation that's doing a kind of follow the leader approach, where you have one truck that's being driven by a real driver, and then another one behind it that's platooning, that is automated. So I think there's some really interesting solutions in the space, and I think there is some economic opportunity there as well. So I think it has a nice mix of technological feasibility alongside some of that market traction. So that'll be an exciting space to watch, over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Got it. We have another question here. Can you define level 2, 3, and 4? Which we probably should have done at the outset. So just refers to the level of autonomy. So level 2 would mean your vehicle is driving itself. Maybe you have hands on the wheel, maybe you don't, but ultimately you're responsible for overseeing that vehicle. So you really can't take your eyes off the road and do something like, read or watch Netflix or something.
Mhm.
Level 3 would be introducing the basically no human supervision in some scenarios. So something like a traffic jam chauffeur for highways, which Louis mentioned. You can take your eyes off the road, but you have to be ready to retake control at any given time when the system prompts you to do so. If it gets into a situation the system doesn't feel comfortable with. Level 4 would be basically extending level 3 to where the human is never going to be asked to take control. And so this is really where I think when we talk about autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars, it's really kind of level 4 that most people think about.
Yeah, you could imagine like removing the steering wheel at level 4.
Yep, exactly. We have a question on cybersecurity here for you, Louis. So question is, if hacking can take down pipeline infrastructure, isn't autonomous vehicle systems both vulnerable and high risk? And what can be done to mitigate this risk?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are actually a number of automotive cybersecurity startups in the mix right now, and they usually do pitch, automated vehicles and vehicle connectivity as one of the areas that they target. Um, it is a really big question, and as always, like the most vulnerable piece of any IT or OT uh, area is going to be like human error. So I think there's those are the areas that you want to work around, and I can see especially within teleoperation being a key part of automated vehicles or specifically robo taxis. I think that there should definitely be a focus put into securing teleoperations for any kind of robo taxi service would be a key point.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. I think so. The question is, I think robotaxis are not for younger generations, but older generations. Do you count the effect of countries whose major population is older? So it's not something we considered in our forecast, but that's, I think a use case we very much agree with. Some of the early companies in the space, Voyage, which Ford just acquired, I think is a really good example of this. Really they were focused on a retirement community that was, I think, a really favorable environment for autonomous vehicles. You have, privately owned streets. You have very kind of limited other traffic in that area. And as you said, there's kind of a need for it as we want to kind of get aging populations away from driving. And there absolutely is kind of a safety aspect. I think this is something I've heard a lot, talking about autonomous vehicles with some of our Japanese clients, a country which does have a little bit more of an aging population than other countries. So agreed, I think that's, absolutely, I think a promising opportunity and a good way to think about some early applications for robotaxis. Maybe a bit of a broader question here. I know we've mentioned a couple of startups, but Louis, maybe I'll first pose this one to you. Any startups that you think are really interesting working in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question because when we look at kind of like the main players, like groups like Aurora and Cruise were startups at one point, but now they're really quite solidified in like they are the players that are doing major acquisitions, whether it's like with Lyft or Uber, and like you're not going to start a company within the last few years or today that's going to be a major competitor with them. So a lot of the activity that we see that's interesting in the space of automated vehicles are companies that can provide something for these groups. So whether it's something like automated data labeling, so you can help feed your algorithms and speed up that process, which is very time intensive, or very specific parts of the perception stack, like I'm thinking of a company called Perceptive Automata, which does some work around like trying to make estimates about what a pedestrian is thinking or going to do at any moment. Like these very specific parts of the whole stack are going to be like what's interesting to help support some of these now much more solidified, much larger players. Obviously, there's interesting work in kind of the delivery spaces. We can talk about Neuro for last mile delivery, or Udelv, who's working with Mobileye right now, as well as all those middle mile players too. But I think on the whole, I expect a lot of the delivery companies to either partner up or be acquired. And I think that the ones that are going to provide the most value are the ones that have that like an interesting specific piece of either the stack or the business model that's going to provide some value over time.
Yeah, and I think for me, thinking about interesting startups in this space, I referenced Navia, Easy Mile, May Mobility as kind of a handful. I think those types of companies, and I definitely put Optimus Ride in this category. It's kind of interesting, kind of solving the economic problem where, if it's a really high, dollar per mile cost, one solution to getting around that is, well, get more people in the vehicle, right? Spread that cost per mile out across, multiple passengers. So I think the form factors are probably bound to change, especially if we think about the fact that we're taking vehicles designed to, handle crashes at very, very high speeds, very heavy, very robustly built, and then using them in operational design domains where they're never going above 25 miles an hour, and neither is the traffic they're interacting with. So maybe there's an opportunity for more passengers, smaller form factors, more affordable vehicles, which could be one of those things that is able to move the needle on the economics of robo taxis.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question here. In cities, how will pedestrians accept, basically having robots? Eye contact in close proximity to cars is critical. Yeah, I think basically the kind of city side of the equation, which we haven't talked about too much, right? Like how accepted is this by cities, is a really important part of that conversation. And I think it's, the pedestrian acceptance part, I think that will come with time and more exposure to the technology. I'm always a bit hesitant of the various kind of consumer studies, that say things like, oh, consumers don't want this technology. And it's like, well, you're asking mostly people who haven't experienced the technology before what their opinions on it are. But the other thing I think to consider is from the city perspective, what impact does it have on emissions and congestion? If it's an electric vehicle, I think it's easy to make an argument it's going to have a positive effect on emissions. But with congestion, there have been some more academic studies which suggest unregulated robotaxis will just increase congestion. It's going to replace trips that might have happened with public transit, with robotaxi with less occupancy. So regulations like what types of trips a robotaxi can make, I think are on the horizon. Things like robotaxis can't take you directly downtown, but they can take you to a hub with various forms of transit where maybe you can take a train for the bulk of your journey. So kind of more of a middle mile, last mile solution is possible. And I think that's probably all the time we have for questions today. So I want to thank you once again for joining, and take care, everyone.